Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. Today I have Nick with me.
Hello.
And we're going to be discussing Elizabeth Gaskell's novel North and South. Before we get into talking about the book, we should say that this video is going to be very full of spoilers, so if you haven't read North and South and you don't want to be spoiled for the plot, maybe don't watch this video, but if you have read North and South, feel free to stick around and we will be discussing it.
Or if you don't care about spoilers.
Yeah, or if you don't care about spoilers.
But it will be beginning to end.
Yes,
so.
many spoilers for North and South.
North and South tells the story of one woman's heartwarming journey to discover that northern people have souls.
Nick didn't like North and South very much.
I did like North and South.
Pretending to me that he did like it a bit, but everything you say about it informs me that you hated
liked
it.
North and South very much. I'm not sure whether I liked Margaret. I think North and South is a very good book, but I found Margaret's... I don't know, because I think Margaret is set up at the beginning as having a very patronising attitude towards people from the north and people in trade. And I think the end of the book is written like she's had a massive, change of heart. But I don't think we see most of that change of heart, would be my main complaint.
I just think that's not true, though, because I think, the whole, narrative arc of the book and Margaret's character arc is her growing to understand, everybody around her more. And I think that's, very clear in the book throughout in all of her actions. You know, the way her relationship, her friendship with the Higgins family begins with her offering to bring them things, and then she learns to sort of, develops a proper friendship with them, and she initially looks down on Mr. Thornton and ends by feeling very differently. You know, at the beginning of the book she is so snobbish about trade and mills in general, and at the end of the book she ends up, investing all her money in wanting to restart a mill and be involved in that. And actually, we see this massive transformation over the course of the book in Margaret's character, from her initial prejudices to understanding the people around her so much more.
So I think maybe what I'm getting at is I agree with you that things do change. I think it's because I think at the beginning there's some really great bits where Gaskell sort of distances herself from Margaret's opinions. I really like the bit where she says to the Higginses, "Oh, shall I come and visit you?" And they're like, "What?
Why?" Yeah.
We haven't invited you. Why would we want you to visit? Which I think is great, because obviously she has a very different idea of. I suppose as well, it's difficult to unpack what sort of class prejudice, what's sort of the fact that she's been a vicar's daughter in a rural community which has a very different sort of setup to an industrial town. Yeah. And I think it's what's interesting, isn't it? That obviously the novel sets up the industrial north against the sort of rural south. But that's not really, and I think it's interesting that it doesn't spend a huge amount of time describing London. Yeah. Because although it's a different kind of industry, because it's much more scale, London I think is actually the largest industrial city in the UK for most of
and Margaret has spent a lot of her time in London. But actually what she compares Milton Northern, which is thinly veiled Manchester, to is the South. And I think it's partly because at this time, now obviously Manchester's very big, but in the 19th century it was getting bigger, but it was a lot smaller than London, to the extent that I think Margaret views it more as a smaller community than it is in my head, because I know it's Manchester.
But what I was driving at before is not that at the end Margaret doesn't have a different opinion, because I agree obviously she starts by being trade, how vulgar, and at the end she's like, I'm going to invest all my money to get a good return. But she obviously does have a different attitude from the beginning to the end, but I feel like we spend so much time in Margaret's head and I never felt like I really saw that shift. The only point where I think there is a sort of definitive reassessing what she thought of before is Helston, when she goes back to Helston towards the end of the book. But I think that's quite specific to her opinion of the South, rather than looking at her opinion of trade and stuff. And I think...
But do you not think, for example, the moments when Mr. Higgins says that he might go south and Margaret's like, I don't think you should actually, it's not all so great as I've maybe painted it to be. And also the moment where she knows that Mr. Thornton's, I've covered up for her because of the lie that she told the police officer. And when she realises what he's done and that he would now think badly of her, her opinion of him has changed, and she cares about his opinion and what he thinks of her more than she ever would have done way earlier on in the novel.
I believe her change in opinion about Mr. Thornton.
Okay.
Specifically.
Well, good.
I think it's a really good love story.
Best.
I believe that.
Best.
To take your example of where she says to Mr. Higgins, oh, maybe you shouldn't go south because actually it's not great. I think that's a great moment, but that came a bit out of the blue for me because I don't feel that I think it's fascinating that it's a book that's very psychological and spends a lot of time in Margaret's head, but I'm not sure I really felt that shift had happened.
It's interesting because
beforehand, if you know what I mean.
I think I feel it when I read the book, but also I've read the book so many times that I don't know. It's very hard for me to judge it objectively in that way because obviously every time I read it now, and every time I've read it since I was like 14 or 13, in fact, it's been a long time since I first read it, it's like 15 years. I've always known what the trajectory of her character arc is, so I feel it, and maybe I read more into it than is there, I don't know. But I've always felt like I really love Margaret's character arc in it, and like I get a good sense of it. And I've always, like, Gaskell is one of my favourite Victorian writers, but I think also she is wonderful for characterisation, and her characterisation is very, very compelling.
Yeah, I believe in Margaret. I believe that Margaret exists and she's a very realised character, and that's what I find a bit jarring, is because I think Margaret is quite psychologically real, but I don't think I felt those shifts in her psychology in advance of her making statements about her changed opinion. I just didn't feel those quite lined up. I think the other problem I have with Margaret is that she's just a bad person.
She's not a bad person.
She does such dreadful things.
She really
like
does,
when she
though.
doesn't tell her father that her mother is dying because it's best for him not to know. And I think the book basically tacitly supports her in that decision, and she never sort of expresses regret, even when they actually tell Mr. Hale and he's really hurt and sad that he hasn't been told. And I just think that's unforgivable, actually. And she never repents for that at all, which I just think is like, yeah.
I just don't think Margaret's a bad person. I think, like, don't get me wrong, not everything she does is, like, perfect. But one of the reasons why I really like Margaret is because I think she is very fully realised, and I think she is flawed, but also you get a good sense of her, and also she does do good things and she does try her best. Like, there are so many moments with Margaret that I love. I think one of my favourite is the bit where, like, Boucher has died and no one will tell his wife because no one else can bear to, and her father and Nicholas Higgins just can't do it, and Margaret is stronger than all of them and she can. And I love the moments where Margaret is stronger than everyone around her, and like, you know, we were talking about this before, when they need to move to Milton and her father and mother are just like, well, we don't really know what to do, and Margaret's like, we need to find a house, I'm going to go and find a house. And I think Margaret is so capable, and so much more capable than women were expected to be in the Victorian period, that I will always really love her as a character for that. And that will always really impress me, and I think is really important part of her character. And that yes, she may have flaws in her judgment, but she really sticks by her judgment, and she really, like, just does things and gets on with life, which I always really like.
Yeah, and I'd agree that she's a strong character, and I wouldn't say that she has no redeeming features or she doesn't do anything good. Like, and I think her relationship with the Higginses is quite nice, and I think, yes, I agree that bit where she tells Boucher's widow is pleasant, but then, and again, this is probably more a symptom of the time, but then immediately afterwards she comments that, you know, they've got Irish blood, which is why they're...
Yeah, I think also you don't read as much Victorian literature as me, and so I think some of the problematic common opinions found in Victorian literature probably impress themselves more on you.
Well, I think that's something I find... obviously, I did an essay on anti-Irish sentiment when I was at undergrad level. I'm not surprised to discover it. I think what took me a bit aback is that I'm not quite convinced by Margaret's transition, but I am convinced that Elizabeth Gaskell agrees with the position that Margaret seems to have at the end of the book, and doesn't agree with the position that Margaret has at the beginning of the book. Yeah. And the whole book is about unpacking prejudices against sort of working class people, against people from a different geographic region, I suppose. Although it's hard to separate from class, really. In the North South divide.
It's all about how people have made their money, isn't it? Not just where they're from.
It's always been hard to separate from class, but I think the whole book is about unpacking prejudice, and I think Elizabeth Gaskell in general, as an author, is really good at, like, skewering prejudice, and I think I found it quite jarring that she sort of addresses all of these prejudices in quite a lot of depth, and not just one. Like it's about sort of the capabilities of women, about class difference.
Yeah, even like religious differences.
Yeah, religious differences. Yeah. But then there's just this very sort of generic and unexamined prejudice against the Irish that I think Elizabeth Gaskell seems to share. I mean, it's particularly interesting because actually there's a bit about Catholicism, which often gets tied up with anti-Irish sentiment, where she's very much doesn't express an opinion, or like certainly isn't overly critical of it.
And Gaskell in general is, in the way she talks about religion in quite a lot of her different novels, there isn't just one way of being a Christian for Gaskell. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of different ways to be a Christian and to be religious.
I was surprised to find what is seems to be a fairly relaxed attitude towards Catholicism on the part of the author, if not all the characters, and still to have just a generic anti-Irish sentiment, which I just found very interesting. And I did find that slightly jarring as a modern reader, to come across that one prejudice that she didn't seem able to see, not even tackle, like I think.
No, I think the other thing you said you were struggling with about Margaret was the kind of paternalism, which, you know, is again a very Victorian thing, isn't it?
Well, I think the problem is that Mr. Thornton, if you want to look at the book as a sort of dichotomy between Mr. Thornton and Margaret, Mr. Thornton is not exactly unrestrained capitalism, but it's enterprise and trade and sort of, you know, free trade, if you like, I suppose, rather than a completely, like, anarchic capitalism without any limits. And actually he obviously moves throughout the book towards a slightly more, like, reciprocal idea of, like, capitalism. But I think what's interesting, obviously, most people would say that what Mr. Thornton was doing in 1850 is not something we'd accept now as like labour practices or all sorts of things. But we're still having those arguments about what level of control we should put on the free market and all sorts of things. Like, it's not unrecognisable. But Margaret's vision of like a paternalistic England feels quite alien now. I don't think anyone's really advocating for that in the same way.
And from a modern perspective, her attitudes feel very patronising. Because, you know, what she wants in comparison to Mr. Thornton is better lives for his workers and better, you know, living standards and quality of life for people who are working in mills, but also her image of how you would create that is through masters having more control to a certain extent, or you know, having more control over how people spend their money. But I don't think that is necessarily how she feels towards the end. And I think certainly getting to know the Higgins family better and seeing them as independent individuals who make their own choices, I think is an important kind of growing point for Margaret. But yeah, I do think there are aspects of her earlier on in the novel, and, you know, the fact that she wants to bring a basket to the Higgins and they're like, well, maybe we don't want your charity, I think is important, and is something that Gaskell is kind of criticising in North and South, that there has to be something in between paternalism that is patronising and capitalism that is ruthless. And I think, like, for me, I've always felt that the point of North and South is that Margaret and Mr. Thornton, from those different opinions, can come together to create a middle ground that's good in all ways. But yeah.
So I agree with that, but I suppose what I'd say, if you're looking at it from that perspective, is that Mr. Thornton definitely moves towards, I suppose you could call it more paternalistic, but towards a sense, you know, what you might call social responsibility now of that, and how there are things that you can do that are to the mutual advantage of both the master and the men. And I feel like Margaret's journey is towards accepting trade, and like, but I don't feel that we really see Margaret's position on things like paternalism right at the end.
But do you not think her friendship with Nicholas Higgins in itself is understanding, like, her understanding of people from a different class to herself has completely changed?
I think she does understand the issues more. Because I think at the beginning of the book she's ignorant. At the end of the book I think that she probably does understand the problems, but I don't know what she thinks, if that makes sense. And I think the only real sort of later engagement with the book, with that issue in the book in the later half from Margaret, is on the issue of the Union, which is quite interesting because it's not a huge part of the book, even though obviously the Union is quite an interesting, like, invisible force in the book. which I think Gaskell is quite negative towards.
I don't know. I think there is a sense that both the Union can be tyrannical as much as masters can, which again I think sort of is interesting to look at, and they're still fairly new at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think she makes some very interesting arguments about how, you know, and I think it's something that's been grappled with for a long time. You know, what unions are only really effective when you have mass membership, and so actually, I mean, we're having an argument in a different way, I suppose, at the moment, aren't we, about to what extent you can compel individuals to do things that they don't want to do for the good of the collective, but the unions only really work if you have lots, like massive majority of people are part of them. But equally, you are cutting across people's right to free choice if you compel them by all sorts of unpleasant measures to join the union.
Yeah. And Boucher is a really interesting character, and his plot line is always something I find very interesting in North and South.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the problem I have is that Margaret criticises the union, and I think Gaskell criticises the union for being tyrannical through Margaret. But Margaret's position is kind of that the masters should exercise their own enlightened despotism instead of the union. So it's not. It doesn't feel very intellectually consistent.
Yeah, I guess so. And obviously, like, Nicholas Higgins is a very sympathetic character, but he does slightly move away from the unions later on.
I'm glad he didn't renounce the union, actually, because I thought that was where we were leading towards, and I was like, I'm going to be absolutely furious if that happens. And there were 2 things I thought we were building towards that didn't happen, and I'm immensely glad that they didn't happen, and that was one of them. Because I was.
What was the other one?
I thought right at the end that Mr. Thornton was going to become an MP. There's a bit where they're having a conversation. It's like, oh, you know, and I was like, oh, no, that would be a bad choice. Yeah. Basically, I think my issue with Margaret is that I think there's a lot of. I think she's a really compelling character. You know, I don't think she's not actually horrible, obviously. But I think there's all sorts of things that I take issue with in the first half of the book, and only one of them is really addressed as a problem. And actually, to an extent, kind of in Margaret's head, the only thing she does wrong in the book is lie about, you know, to protect her murderous mutineering brother. That was another plot thread that slightly disappointed me, actually. I think Frederick, I think, is very interesting, but that's the only thing I think she thinks she's done that's wrong. Yeah. And I actually think she's done quite a lot of things that are wrong. And, you know, she's very brave. I really like the scene where she confronts the men.
Yeah, like, that's
a cracking scene. And I think I believe her relationship with Mr. Thornton completely. And I was definitely rooting for them to end up together. Yeah. But I think that I don't agree with her decision to basically decide what's best for her father.
I haven't reread North and South for about 2 or 3 years, so I feel like I'll reread it at some point in the next year, and then I'll come up with a really good defence.
Well, I look forward to it.
If I don't remember that bit well enough. There are bits that are kind of properly imprinted on my mind. There are other bits that don't stick with me quite as much.
Out of interest, sort of moving slightly on from Margaret, but on a related point, what do you think? Do you think it's implied that Frederick was in the right to mutiny or not?
I think it is. But again, I don't know how well I remember those sections. My reading of it has always been that the captain that Frederick mutinies against was kind of barbarically cruel to the extent that there was nothing else that they could do. That was my reading of it, but again, I haven't read it for a couple of years.
Yeah, because I think the mutiny is really interesting, because it's always talked about by them as, you know, it's unjust to Frederick, and you know, he always did the right thing. And, you know, but basically, they only have Frederick's word that what he did was justified, and they're never able to find any witnesses. Because I thought, I was expecting at some point towards the climax of the book, Frederick was going to be exonerated or found guilty, which I was kind of rooting for, to be honest, because I think that would have been interesting. But if you think about it, all we get is Frederick's letters and his word that the mutiny was justified. Yeah. And then he turns up, when his mother dies, like, I think there's a bit where he just breaks down completely. Yeah. He's clearly a man of strong emotions. Yeah. And then he kills someone and leaves.
It is an accident, though. What happens
Well,
to Lennox.
it is an accident, but I think it's quite interesting in that it's kind of neatly brushed under the rug. But, like...
Well, I suppose the thing is, as well, you know that Margaret lies to protect Frederick, and Mr. Thornton knows, and Mr. Thornton, as a magistrate, finds that Lennon's died by accident. And you don't know to what extent it's all to protect Margaret, or to what extent it is half
To channel
true.
Mr. Higgins there, didn't you, Margaret?
Margaret. But, you know, you don't know to what extent Mr. Thornton is acting purely for Margaret, or is acting from the evidence he's found, or if wanting to save Margaret has coloured the way he interprets what he's found. Like, you never actually know to what extent Lennon's death was an accident. Yeah.
What they say is that it's unclear to what extent the fall... They basically said that he had a long-term condition.
Yeah.
So he was likely to have died anyway. It's not clear whether the fall, the drinking, or the cold was what actually did for him. But when Mr. Thornton makes his decision not to hold an inquiry, the thought that's upmost in his mind is protecting Margaret. And I find that it's the only bit of the book where I was disappointed in Mr. Thornton.
What I love about Elizabeth Gaskell, though, is that everyone is really complicated, and that it isn't... Nothing is straightforward in Gaskell, and none of the characters are straightforward, and none of them are black and white, good and bad. But and it is something I just, maybe Frederick isn't so innocent, and maybe he is.
Well, I find that really interesting.
It's grey, and I like that.
But what I found fascinating is that Margaret is much more preoccupied by the fact that she told a lie to a police officer than that her brother might have killed someone. I feel like that's actually a bit that I think I found quite shocking. In that Margaret is a character I would have expected to be affected by that. And she just, you know, obviously Lennox is not characterised as a nice man.
No, but
and she just doesn't seem that bothered that he's dead. You know, the only context in which she thinks about it is whether it will impede Frederick's escape from England, rather than being like, maybe my brother's a murderer as well as a mutineer.
But do you think that's also partly because, like, her mother's just died and her brother is in danger of his life and she just can't think about anything else? Like, she just doesn't...
I think that's a reading you could put on it, but I don't think
in different circumstances, if her mother hadn't just died...
I'm not sure it's supported by the book, would be what I'd say. Because I think, actually, it's a wonderful portrayal of grief. When her mother dies in particular. But I think once that danger to Frederick emerges... it kind of... the narrator only talks about her, like, fear for Frederick. And that's her motivating factor when she's lying to the police officer.
But I think that's partly because she's just lost one family member, and the idea of losing another is too much. I always think that's so bound up together.
I don't have a problem with her overriding motivation to be lie to the police to protect Frederick. And I think it's really interesting because it's obviously... she dwells on that for the whole rest of the book, and that's like her defining moment. And I think I'm very much of the opinion that Mr. Bell expresses as like, I think that you could probably justify it. Like, I'm not sure I would condemn that.
I do think it's interesting as well that, like, to be a liar and to tell a lie has a different significance within the Victorian imagination. Like, there are other novels I can think of where someone else accuses someone of being a liar and they're like, we should have a duel now. Like, I feel like if you called someone a liar now, it wouldn't be considered so bad as it was in the Victorian period. I feel like it has a slightly different context, but I don't really know how to properly explain that.
No, and I can see where you're coming from. But I just find it fascinating that actually Lennox's death is kind of secondary to Margaret's lie.
But we have been talking about grief and death, so we should talk about that more. So the original working title for North and South, or the original considered title before it was called North and South, was Death and Variations. And it's quite an interesting book to look at in terms of grief and death and how much death there is in it, because there is a hell of a lot of death in North and South. I mean, let's see who dies. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Hale, obviously. We have Mr. Bell, we have Leonard, we have Boucher, we have Boucher's wife, we have Bessie Higgins. So that's 7 characters who are important. We also know about Mr. Thornton's father's death and the complicated circumstances of that. But it's quite interesting that there is a lot of death in North and South and that there are a lot of very different deaths and how they kind of compare to each other.
Yeah, I think Gaskell's got a genius for writing, like, psychologically real characters, and I think particularly Mr. Hale's reaction to his wife's death is probably one of the most convincing explorations of grief I've read in a novel of any era.
Gaskell writes absolutely fantastically about grief in all her books, and I think she addresses it brilliantly, because I think often in Victorian literature, and when we think about the Victorian period, we think about the fact, people died young more often and things like that, and that often death in Victorian literature is a plot point rather than an emotional point, I suppose. But in Gaskell, it's so clearly both, and she does address grief and people's grief so realistically, I think.
I agree, and I think actually it's been an interesting year to read North and South, because I think there is a sort of consciousness that pervades the whole book and all of the characters in it, that the sort of the threads that connect them to the world are quite thin.
Yeah.
And I think there's a really good moment where Mr. Bell wakes up in his hotel room and is suddenly by the fact that his friend's dead, and because again Mr. Bell's grief for his friend is explored, but it's not a key point. But then there's just suddenly a bit where we see Mr. Bell being oh. Yeah. And sort of waking up not exactly in terror, but in the night with that nagging anxiety. I think.
Yeah.
What did Dickinson call it? The tooth that nibbles at the soul. I think. And I think that's something that we've perhaps lost in the modern world, which I think one of the consequences of this year has been a slightly discomforting reminder that there are forces beyond our control that can just pluck people away.
And I think it's interesting because there is a lot about illness, and a lot of the characters in the novel who die of illnesses, and then there are people who are sort of quite a lot of environmental factors, I suppose, and the fact that Bessie is ill, and mostly from having worked in factories. Mrs. Hale believes that part of the reason why she is so ill is because she's left this place that she loves, and because she is miserable. And then we also have Lennox, obviously, who meets his death by violence to a certain extent, at least, and also both Boucher and Mr. Thornton's father, we know, both killed themselves. And there's a lot of different kinds of death and different kinds of grief that are explored.
Mm-hmm. And then Mr. Hale just goes quietly in the night.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and Mr. Bell has an awful lot of warning that he's going to die, which is sort of a very, very different thing.
Well, I think Mr. Bell was the point where I was like, is this one too many deaths? And I appreciate that it was a plot necessary death.
He is the death that is the most. Well, I suppose Leonard's as well. But Mr. Bell's death is very important to the plot in terms of Margaret getting her financial independence and so on.
Yeah, and I think on balance it probably was the right choice, but I was starting to suffer slightly from death fatigue by the time she killed off Mr. Bell. But I think there's something quite nice, well, not nice, but sort of a bit beautiful about their letters where he's like, oh mate, I'm just grumpy or whatever, but actually, he probably knows that he's not well.
Yeah.
And I think that builds nicely on that moment that we see in the hotel room where he's obviously afraid of death, and I think it's
well explored.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one as well, because obviously for Margaret, Mr. Hale just goes away and never comes back.
Yeah.
Whereas she sees her mother die, but we follow Mr. Hale, so we see Mr. Hale die.
Yeah.
But Mr. Bell just stops writing, if you like, and then just doesn't turn up for dinner. Which I think is it's a very interesting exploration, and I can see. I think on balance, North and South is a better title and because I think that's more important to the book. But I can see why Death and Variations would have been an appropriate title as well. Should we talk about northernness in North and South?
Yes, we should. And then I'm sure there's some other characters we need to address later. Mostly.
It's really interesting. I'm trying to think. The only other book from the Victorian period I've read set in the North is Hard Times.
Yeah.
Set in it's Preston, isn't it? But
Coketown. But yes, Preston.
Everyone's afraid to give them their real names because they're really rude about them. Because I think that's fascinating. That was written slightly earlier, was it? around the same time, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I want to look it up now.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were published in the same year, so yeah, they must have, I mean, I don't know the months, but I expect their serialisation must have crossed over, because North and South was serialised over a longer period of time. That's really interesting.
That is very interesting.
Yeah. And Gaskell and Dickens knew each other a bit, so interesting.
I don't get any distinct sense of northernness from Hard Times. I think it's very much about industrialisation,
Yeah.
but I don't think the characters would feel out of place in Dickensian London.
Yeah.
Whereas northernness is incredibly important
Yeah.
to
North and South.
to North
and
and South.
Gaskell, like, Dickens was very, very much a Londoner looking on from the outside, whereas Gaskell, she lived like the first 9 months of her life in London or something, but she grew up in Knutsford, which is what Cranford is based on, which is a sort of small market town in Cheshire. So she spent a lot of her life in the north. She spent a lot of time living in Manchester with her husband. I think she spent some of her life in the south, but a lot of her life was spent in the north.
She certainly was a member of the community she was writing about. But I think it's fascinating the way they explore, like, the idea that the north... There's some really interesting ideas there. There's the idea of the north, like, forging ahead, which is obviously not something that tends to be in the north-south discourse now. The idea of the north being more Anglo-Saxon I found really interesting, and, like, Germanic.
Yeah.
And, like, unexpressive and, like, hardy and basically, like,
Tough.
dissenting and Protestant.
Yeah.
And, like, there are stereotypes about toughness in, like, the idea of northernness now, but actually, I think in the modern age... If you were not maybe the modern age, but if you were talking about the 20th century, you'd say that the North was more Catholic. The North was more demonstrative of their emotion, actually. And
yeah, I mean, now there is a big stereotype that everyone from London especially, but a lot of the south is really unfriendly, and in the north of England that's where everyone's really friendly, and that is not the stereotype in north and south. In north and south it is the opposite. It's everyone's nice and kind of, friendly in the south, and in the north everyone's like, go away, mind your own business, which now is very much not the stereotype.
I think I found it really interesting, and I think again you'd probably talk about the north as more Celtic than Anglo-Saxon.
I think you'll find you should read Mary Barton sometime, because some of that's set in Liverpool as a Liverpudlian. I think you'd find it interesting.
It's fascinating because you can see the modern... I suppose, should we... I guess a lot of your viewers aren't British, are they? Like, there's a very... In the UK, there is a very strong sense of what's usually called the north-south divide. And how the north of the country and the south of the country are very different to each other and have different outcomes, and there's a lot of arguments about economic unfairness right at the moment. But to be honest, this Gaskell is writing at the time when this was coming into being, because
because the north in the 19th century is very much associated with trade and like mills and making cotton and manufacturing, and the south is not, even though there was manufacturing in London. Like the 19th century has this idea that there is this great divide between sort of the rural farming south and the industrial north, which wasn't necessarily strictly true, but that was the idea.
London and Birmingham are both major manufacturing centres as well, but they are more small scale. Like Birmingham's really famous for its goldsmiths and like you say, artisanal. And London, they're smaller scale factories that serve the immediate population.
Yeah, and I think the kind of association of huge machines and massive use of machinery is associated with the north in the 19th century.
And I think the thing is, and there's a bit at the end which is sort of alluded to in North and South, like Mr. Thornton may be a prominent Middleton manufacturer in the same way that you might have a prominent London manufacturer, but the prominent London manufacturer serves the London market and maybe the hinterland. Mr. Thornton is buying cotton in North America and selling it in Asia. Like he's global. I think like the industrialisation of the process, like you might have a factory in the south, which is lots of people making things, whereas in the north you have machines making things, like you said. I think
people operating machines, and I think that is something that scares the Victorians in many ways. And obviously that's more of an issue in something like Hard Times than North and South to a certain extent, I think. But the idea that people operating machines and that workforces and industries being reliant on machines might make people care less about each other is definitely a big concern of the 19th century.
But I suppose the sense that Gaskell, and it's interesting because I think it's probably always been an idea as much as it's been a reality, but Gaskell is talking about the idea of like the pace of technological change, and she talks about like a north that's racing ahead and a south that's a bit sleepy, but also in some respects kind of nice for being sleepy, even if people are starving. I think that's something that's carried through into the modern age, isn't it? Of us all sort of hurtling towards we know not what.
Yeah. I feel like there are some other characters we haven't addressed, like Mrs. Thornton.
I really like Mrs. Thornton. Mrs. Thornton's one of my... Yeah, she's an excellent character.
She's great. I really like Mrs. Thornton. I think she's a very, very interesting character. And Mr. Thornton, too, is one of my favourites.
I think the Thorntons are really interesting. And it's a really interesting... I found it fascinating, like, it's sort of to link back to the North-South divide. There are things that she talks about, like, as sort of stereotypical of a northern family, that I actually do recognise in like, I think possibly some of the things she describes are a bit old-fashioned now, but they're things that I can remember being like defining, like having a special room and things for guests and stuff. And you know, whether that's working class or northern is hard to untangle sometimes. I think, but it's very interesting.
And Mrs. Thornton, I think, is one of my favourite characters. She's very, very compelling and very impressive. And I like her and Margaret's complicated relationship and kind of grudging dislike, but sometimes respect of each other.
I like the fact that they both recognise in the other one that they're both, like, competent women in a world that doesn't expect women to be competent.
Exactly, yeah.
But they also don't really like each other, which I think is actually I think is a really nice dynamic.
Yeah, it's done well, isn't it? But also that they could possibly one day like each other. I don't know. One would hope. Well, yeah, hopefully, for Mr. Thornton's sake.
I do like the bit at the end where Mr. Thornton's like, your aunt will be like, that man, and your mother will be like, that woman.
I love that, actually. I love the last two lines, because it
is a really solid ending of the book, which was slightly spoilt by I listened to it on audiobook, and I believe right at the end, the line I think is something like, Mr. Thornton, you know, voice husky with emotion, which my audio says Margaret's name, and I think my audiobook narrator chose to read it as Margaret, which didn't quite convey, I think, all the tender love and affection that I was expecting.
I think this is the Juliet Stevenson audiobook, which I'm very excited to listen to at some point in the future, and I think Juliet Stevenson is a wonderful narrator. I'm listening to Little Dorrit with her at the moment, and she's great. I
would say in general as a narrator she was fine. She does really good voices, but she's a little bit slow. I know you speed it up,
if you listen to it at 1.25 speed.
That's not something I believe in. But if you speed it up, I'm sure you would get rid of the slow problem.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I had a huge number of problems with her performance, but just the Margaret didn't. It was a very odd choice. I would have said as a performance.
I do like the ending though.
I suppose we can move on to talking about let's do the book structure in a second. We were talking about characters, weren't we? I think,
Henry Lennox was the character we're going to talk about.
I really, really like Henry Lennox, actually, because I think throughout the book, you're kind of like, he's like this quick-witted...
Is he going to be slimy?
Well, he's a quick-witted, sarcastic lawyer, like, well, we all know where this is going. And actually, he's just... It doesn't do anything wrong throughout the book.
I really love the fact that at the end, Henry Lennox is supposed to turn up to the meeting with Mr. Thornton and Margaret, and he just doesn't come. And he doesn't come because he knows that Margaret is in love with Mr. Thornton. He actually does love Margaret enough in one way. Although he kind of would also like her money, he also is like, actually, I want her to be happy, so I'm not going to come. And I've always loved that bit, because I think it's a really nice moment.
It's a fascinating thing, isn't it? Because obviously, actually, he's pursued her since before she had money.
Yeah.
And he continues to pursue her before Mr. Bell dies and before anyone knows that
it's just a nice added bonus, isn't it?
But then I love the fact that Elizabeth Gaskell says that he obviously considers the fact that the money would be useful.
Yeah, yeah.
And that, that is he's a man who he's a very considered man, and he's very practical. So he's not thought about it, and he's not thought about how it would be advantageous to him. But that's not why he's doing it, if you know what I mean. It's not the overriding reason. And I think it's really, I suppose the question is, does he stay away at the end, which obviously Gaskell doesn't comment on. Does he stay away because he's like, that's their moment.
Yeah.
Or does he stay away because he's like, I just can't bear to watch them? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess so. And I've always thought it was the first, and that it's like an act of generosity and kindness. But maybe it's also because he's like, I would be too sad.
Yeah,
yeah, which is also sad.
Yeah, I mean, putting aside the legal ethics of trying to seduce your client, I think Mr. Lennox is quite a nice character. I think it's interesting because he's kind of throughout. He remains a presence throughout the book much more than the Shaws, I think.
Yeah.
Even though he's not in it much more than they are.
Yeah.
Partly because of Frederick and the mutiny. And, I mean, that's a storyline, I suppose we've already talked about Frederick itself, but that's a storyline that I found slightly dissatisfying.
It's interesting that I think Henry Lennox, his role in the novel doesn't require him to be as nice as he is.
She almost seems to take a perverse pleasure in making Mr. Lennox seem really nice.
Well, that's one of the things, as I said, that I love about Elizabeth Gaskell, is that she is a realist, and she's a realist in the way that Dickens and Austen, my other two favourite authors, aren't. But Gaskell's characters are really complex and complicated and fully developed, and the characters who you don't want to root for, sometimes you root for a little bit, and the characters who don't need to be sympathetic are, and actually her characters are very complicated, and I really love that about her books.
Yeah, and I think, again, to look at other characters like that, the Shaws, so her Aunt Shaw, and then Edith, and Captain Lennox.
Yeah.
I suppose that the Lennox is really most of the book, but
yes.
Gaskell's definitely critical, particularly of Edith, of being a bit of a silly woman, who doesn't really have any interest in what's going on, or it's hard to say whether she's just Gaskell. Well, I'm not sure. Do you think she's written as basically just not very bright, or just completely disinterested?
I think she's written as disinterested. Yeah, I think she's disinterested.
And I think Gaskell's really quite critical of that. And I think there's certainly a bit of criticism at the end of Captain Lennox for just sitting on his money and not doing anything with it, or being productive. Even though it sounds like they have quite a nice life, really. I think I'd choose the Lennox's life over Mr. Thornton's. But, I think there's a lot of implied criticism of Captain Lennox for being a bit pointless, basically. And I like the fact that Henry Lennox criticises him for just doing nothing. For indolence, I suppose. But they're set up to let Margaret down, or I feel like what you'd expect is for them to let Margaret down in some way. Her father dies, she goes back to live with them, this place that was her sanctuary before Helston, or not before Helston, but it's where she starts the book, and they let her down in some way. And they don't really, actually. Obviously Edith's a bit frivolous, but actually she's quite nice to Margaret, even if she's a bit selfish and demanding. Edith is not cruel to Margaret.
No,
she just is thoughtless. And I think it's really interesting, because again, I think Henry Lennox, Captain Lennox, Edith, and Mrs. Shaw are all characters that you would in a Dickens novel, Mrs. Shaw would be a cackling old woman, and and it's fascinating that they're just human beings. They actually are doing their best for Margaret.
Mrs. Thornton in a Dickens novel would be 2 times more stern, 2 times, she'd be Mrs. Clenham in Little Dorrit, and she's not. And I love Gaskell's characterisation. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. The Higginses are very interesting as well. I think I like Bessie Higgins. I suppose Bessie Higgins is because she's obviously got such a deep faith. In a way that's quite interesting, because again, there's a lot of talk about religion in most of the Victorian books I've read, but the inner faith, I'm pretty sure the only book where it's really explored I can think of that I've read is The Picture of Dorian Gray, and that's a very different exploration, and that's much more preoccupied with the idea of sin. And
Gaskell writes, very interestingly about religion, and also, like I said, it's very clear in her books that there are lots of different ways of being religious. I really like the scene where Margaret, Mr. Hale and Mr. Higgins all pray together, even though they have Nicholas Higgins is basically an atheist, more or less, and her father's a dissenter and she's an Anglican, but they all pray together.
It's very interesting, again, because we were talking about prejudice and stuff, and I think it's fascinating. I mean, we talked about the Irish question, but prejudice against trade and like the idea, you know, all of those things, like I think Gaskell has a very definitive stance on as an author. Basically, you know, where Mr. Thornton and Margaret, or at least Mr. Thornton, definitely end up at the end of the book, is kind of what Gaskell thinks is right. And I think that's implied, and there's all sorts of things all the way along. And like there's definitely some great bits early on where there's like an authorial comment that slightly deflates Margaret's sense of self-importance, which I quite like. And I think it's fascinating that she makes no comment on religion. The exploration of faith is fascinating in that it makes almost no comment, and we've just checked. And Elizabeth Gaskell's husband was a Unitarian, so on the hard end of dissent.
Yeah, he was a minister, so
that's not like Methodism, which kind of has a very complicated relationship with Anglicanism and takes quite a long time to break away. Unitarianism is the hard, like, complete opposition theologically to what the Anglican Church was doing. And I think it's fascinating that there's almost no comment on who's right. Even though you have a heroine who is devoted to the Church of England, even though we never really explore why Margaret's devoted to the Church of England. Mr. Hale, who has become a dissenter because he can no longer believe in the Church's sort of dogma. You have Frederick, who converts to Catholicism, and there's some disappointment from Margaret, but she's not more disappointed by Frederick than her father, if you like, and there's no comment from the author on that. There is the only point in the book, which is interesting, having just looked that up, there is a little bit where it talks about Mr. Bell not wanting to think too hard about Mr. Hale's decision because he's uncomfortable that he might come to the same conclusions. And that's the only point in the book where it's like, is that a little nudge one way? But I think it's so interesting that for a book that really deals quite heavily with faith, I mean, Bessie Higgins in particular, who's a really interesting character because she's really important, and then she just dies and that's it. And she's not really referenced again. She's kind of vaguely in the background.
She plays an important part in Margaret's relationship with Nicholas and Mary Higgins because part of her attachment to them is to do with her friendship with Bessie, I guess. But
I think the implication, like, Bessie Higgins is not an Anglican. Like, having the scripture read, like the Days of Judgment and stuff read to her, that's much more like dissent and like, you know, a different sort of flavour of Protestantism. And I think it's very interesting that, like, you have Bessie Higgins's like deep inner faith with Margaret's like coming to visit her as like charitable works, which is much more of an Anglican. And I think it's really
it's very interesting.
It's fascinating that the faith suffuses the book, and yet Gaskell makes almost no comment on it, which I think is really interesting. I think, and that's the thing. The only thing she has to say is that the only actual authorial comment is maybe you should all get along a bit better.
And I think that bit where Nicholas, Margaret and Mr. Hale pray together, and I think the line is something like, it did them no harm.
There's an implication that Mr. Thornton has a very strong faith, and like he talks with Mr. Hale after Mrs. Hale's death about faith in a conversation that we're not really privy to. We're just told about how Mr. Hale feels about it. And I really like that decision. But it's never really addressed what Mr. Thornton thinks or believes. I think there's only one point where he basically says he's a dissenter because he says, you know, I don't share your faith, you know, I don't share your religion, but, you know, give me the credit of my own faith, if you know what I mean. I think, I can't remember exactly the line, but he basically says to Margaret, you know, I have deep religious convictions of my own. Anyway, I think the last thing probably that we were going to talk about was the structure, which I found very interesting because there's quite a lot of plot points in this book. They're not like dropped plot threads, but there are things that don't tie neatly up at the end, which I like a lot. I think, and again, it's a much more a sense of how Gaskell's got a slightly more realist bent than Dickens.
I think so.
But also, I think, and we've talked about this, how the fact that this was serialised really changes the way it's been written. Because I think, for instance, we were talking about Bessie Higgins earlier, and how Bessie Higgins is a really prominent point for the first half of the book, or probably more like the first third, and then drops away. And there's quite a lot of points like that. Like, the middle of the book is kind of dominated by Mrs. Hale's death, and Frederick and like the idea that Frederick might be able to exonerate himself.
In a Dickens novel, Frederick would be exonerated at the end and would come back, and Mr. Lennox would find someone to marry. And I like that that isn't the case. But I when we were talking about whether it's to do with serialisation, whether it's to do with Gaskell's writing style, because the other thing you were saying is that the beginning is quite long and the end is quite long, and if you were thinking about the book in your head, you'd think that the time Margaret spends in Milton is more of the book than it is.
I mean, she does spend like
majority of
2/3 of the book in Milton, I think, but it's more. I think the tail end of the book is much longer than you'd expect it to be now. Like, basically, Margaret leaves Milton, and and the only really important character moment for her before she should get together with Mr. Thornton is going back to Helston and kind of being like, maybe this
isn't the paradise I had in my head,
And I do like the fact, just to go back to like sort of Margaret, the one thing I do like is the fact that one of the things she doesn't like about Helston is the really controlling schoolmistress, like the vicar's wife. And I was like,
maybe that's because she doesn't like paternalism anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's not that I don't think Margaret's changed by the end of the book. It's just that I feel like she just says she's changed and then she's different, rather than we see like a deep inner process. The only process we see is her like confronting the fact that she's told a lie, and that is explored in agonising detail. But actually, I don't feel like that on its own is enough to change her opinion of everything else. Yeah, so I think like the middle of the book is dominated by Mrs. Hale's death and by Frederick, and Frederick's kind of alluded to at the beginning of the book, and like the kind of like tension throughout the middle of the book is whether Frederick's going to get caught, whether he's going to get away, Margaret telling a lie to protect Frederick, and then the ongoing question of whether Frederick will be able to exonerate himself. And then the answer is just no. Yeah. And that's it. Like, that's the thing. It's not that the answer's no that surprises me, but it's basically just like Mr. Lennox writes a letter and it's like, you're probably not going to be able to exonerate him, and that's that. And then Frederick's like, oh, I'll just stay in Spain then and get married, and it's like, oh, that's a slightly odd anticlimax.
Yeah, I don't know. I like that though. I think it's right because it feels more believable.
I think it does feel more believable, but I feel like Gaskell builds up that possibility of exoneration in a way you wouldn't unless you needed tension in the middle of a serialised.
Yeah, and I guess also with a serialised novel, you don't know, depended on the author, how much they planned and how much they changed their mind about what they were going to do as they were going.
And I think serialisation is the other reason why, we were talking before about how, like, from a character perspective, Margaret's just a bit callous about Leonard's death. But serialisation is the reason why she's actually callous about Leonard's death, is because Leonard's death is there to serve a specific dramatic purpose.
And it happened 3 months ago in the narrative or whatever.
And that's it. Like, and then you just dump him, like, because he's served his purpose, which was to create a sense of danger, and that's what he was there for. I think it reads very differently. But the thing I would say that really surprised me, and maybe it's because a longer conclusion without anything happening wouldn't lend itself to a serialised book. The actual end is really abrupt.
Yeah.
Like, we spend loads and loads of time with Margaret in London.
Yeah, and there's like 3 pages of them getting
doing nothing. And then we learn within, like, in the audiobook, it's literally the last 20 minutes is Mr. Thornton is ruined, Mr. Thornton comes to London, Margaret decides to help Mr. Thornton, Margaret and Mr. Thornton get married. Within like 20 minutes, it's like... it's very abrupt.
I remember the first time I read the book, because I had seen the television adaptation first, and the television adaptation ending is a bit more romanticised. The ending of the book really disappointed me because it was so abrupt. But actually, every time I read it, I really like it more, and I actually really love it because I like the realism of it. I like that they're like. I like that Margaret has more money, I like that Mr. Thornton is near ruin and they have to like come together to build something together. And I really like those last 2 lines where they're like, oh god, our family's going to be so disappointed with us. Who cares? I just really like that. I just think it's a really nice ending.
I think it is a nice ending.
Especially because there is so much about family in the book and like the difference. Because, the reason why, Mrs. Thornton will be disappointed because Margaret's, stuck up southerner as far as she's concerned, and Mrs. Shaw thinks that Mr. Thornton is, like a rough northerner. And actually they're like, well, we don't care. And I just really like the ending.
It's not so much that I find the very ending with Mr. Thornton too abrupt. It's that it's too abrupt in comparison to the really long bit. The pre-ending is much too long.
Well, I do know that Gaskell, I believe the version of North and South we usually read now, the ending has some changes from the original serialised version because Gaskell felt that she was forced to rush it, and then she added in some things. But I don't know what she added in. I don't know very much about it, so I'd like to know more about that and look into it more and see what she did change, and what she added in or what she extended and why. It would be quite interesting to look at, I think.
So I think that's most of what we had to say.
I think
isn't it?
so. We're talking for long enough.
So, favourite character?
Mr. Thornton.
Mr. Thornton,
He's
definitely.
the best. Yeah. I also really like Mrs. Thornton. I also really like Nicholas Higgins, and obviously Margaret. I really like.
I would say Mr. Thornton and Henry Lennox. So I was like, actually, if this goes to completely left of field, and that's kind of I'm kind of all right with that. Like I think it definitely would have been the wrong ending,
yes,
but like
I love Mr.
I like Mr. Thornton and Henry Lennox would be my favourite characters. I like Nicholas Higgins as well.
Overall opinion?
Flawed masterpiece.
In amongst the other of my favourite novels you have read, which would include Our Mutual Friend, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Jude the Obscure, where would you rank this amongst them?
So it's definitely above Jude the Obscure, which has a ridiculous ending.
How does it compare?
I think I prefer it to Mansfield Park.
But not to Pride and Prejudice.
I'm not sure whether I prefer it to Pride and Prejudice.
Interesting.
And Pride and Prejudice is more kind of... I don't know.
Would you say, I'm going to put words into your mouth, that Pride and Prejudice is more perfect for what it is, but North and South is more interesting?
I don't know whether
I think that.
I'm not sure whether I think Pride and Prejudice is very interesting.
Yeah, so do I. But I love Pride and Prejudice is one of my favourite things to read, but North and South I think I could talk about more. I don't know. I suppose so
Pride and Prejudice is kind of like a still life, like a perfect painting of like a bowl of fruit. Like it's beautiful and tiny and then like North and South is kind of like one of those massive war paintings, where it covers a whole wall and you've got Wellington over there being shot at by cannon and Napoleon doing like it's just sprawling in a way that's much more Dickensian than Austen. But I'm not sure whether I would say it's better or worse than Pride and Prejudice.
In comparison to Our Mutual Friend, the only book I love more than North and South.
So, I'm going to say definitely above Mansfield Park and definitely above Jude the Obscure. I'm not sure about the other two because I think it does things that are very different to either Pride and Prejudice or Our Mutual Friend. Of the three, I would say I found North and South the most interesting. I think I found Pride and Prejudice possibly the most surprisingly enjoyable and also probably the most polished of the three. And I don't think there's anything I could do to Pride and Prejudice that would actually improve the story. Even killing Mr. Collins would probably be a mistake. There are things I would change in Our Mutual Friend and North and South if I was in charge. Yeah. I would say that Our Mutual Friend is certainly a lot more fun. And I think is kind of... Yeah, I think Our Mutual Friend is probably the more complete work. But I think probably North and South is the most interesting. So I'm going to say definitely better than two of them and then not make a decision on the other three.
There's many more books of my favourites for you to read, but I would quite like to see what you think of Wuthering Heights because I think you might hate it. Yeah, if you think Margaret's not very nice, which
but I'm not
everyone in Wuthering Heights.
But I'm not supposed to like them in Wuthering Heights, whereas Gaskell's like, look at this lovely woman, Margaret. And I'm like, she's not a lovely woman, she's a terrible human being who's lying to her father about his wife's illness.
I don't know what you'll think of Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is like a brilliant, shambolic mess of a wonderful masterpiece of a fantastic, weird book. But yeah.
Intriguing.
Next Victober, maybe.
Maybe next Victober. I think I've got Bleak House penciled in for next Victober.
Yeah, and you also should read Anthony Trollope because I actually really
I think Bleak House or The Warden are the two.
Yeah, I think you'll really like.
Then
Anthony Trollope.
we can talk about High Church and Low Church for 2 hours. I think that'd be quite fun.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah, I think you'd like Anthony Trollope more actually than. Possibly, I feel like you'd like Anthony Trollope most of my favourite Victorian writers. Possibly. So, that's probably enough, isn't it?
I think I would possibly say slightly more than that. Yeah. We certainly had a lot to say about it.
We did, but yeah. I think that's
Let us know what you think about North and South, and
please do.
Whether Margaret is actually evil.
That's all.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for watching.
Enjoy the rest of Victober.
Yeah, and I'm back soon with another bookish video.